Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
One early summer morning in 2006, I was on a train on my way to meet some modern-day slaves. As you may well know, according to the World International Labor Organization, there are 27 million slaves in the world today. They labor as brick makers, coffee harvesters, cigarette rollers, and domestic servants. They are not free to leave. If they try, they are prevented, usually with violence. Millions of them are serially raped in brothels, some of them as young as 9 years old. And even those not enslaved in the sex industry itself are liable to be sexually exploited at the whim of their masters. They're paid nothing beyond the barest amount for their subsistence. And often their pay is ostensibly to pay off debt incurred by themselves or their parents. But in fact, they labor under onerous interest rates that ensure that their debt will never be discharged. This particular train was departing from the incredibly busy train station by my Amtrak-shaped standards in the city of Chennai in southeastern India. And I had come to southeastern India, to Chennai, to meet this man, Jaikumar Christian. Jaikumar is the head of the International Humanitarian and Development Organization World Vision in India. Supervises 8,000 employees doing relief and development work in that country. And I, as a journalist, had asked for a few hours of his time for an interview, assuming we would just meet at his office. But a few days before I was to get to Chennai, he emailed me and he said, plan to get on a train. I need to go to Gutiyatam, and I want you to come with me. So Gutiyatam is a district about 2 hours west of Chennai. And in this particular district of small villages, rural, agricultural India, in all its beauty and all its difficulty, in this district, 9 years before our visit, child slavery had been rampant, endemic in every village in the community. There was one village of about 200 people called Kalangiam, and the Kalangiam Women's Federation had compiled a list of elementary school children who had been enslaved. So this was their list, 20 children in a village of maybe 200 people. So Prabhu, for a bondage amount of 3,000 rupees, which is maybe $60 roughly, had worked in a cycle shop, which doesn't sound so bad until you know these are motorcycles. It's filthy, greasy work, not suitable at all for children. Bubalan had worked at a hand loom for another debt of 3,000 rupees. Prabha Harahan had worked in a cycle shop. Others had worked making matches, just cutting sticks into smaller sticks to make the matches. And others worked making beedies, the little hand-rolled cigarettes. Day after day, no education, prevented from going to school, forced to work, and no doubt not just exploited for these ostensible purposes, but for whatever their master wanted to use them for debts that would amount to what some of us might spend on a decent meal out, but debts that for them would never be repaid. This kind of slavery, of course, is illegal in India and in every country in the world. It's one of the glories of our time that we live in an age when governments have recognized that this is inhuman. And few government officials are eager to admit that it's happening in their country on their watch, but it is happening. The cruel irony is that 2 centuries after the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade by the British Parliament, 150 years after the Union's victory in the American Civil War, more human beings are enslaved today than were trafficked across the Atlantic in the 200 years of chattel slavery in North America. More human beings enslaved right now than were trafficked during that whole 2 centuries of brutality sponsored by our own nation, our own forebears. So it's actually not hard today to meet a slave. There are many to meet. And if you want to understand power at its worst, I suggest you ought to meet a slave. Because enslavement is the worst of power. In enslavement, one human being asserts unlimited power over another. An assertion that requires an inflation and a deflation. An inflation of the slave owner's own power to unholy, godlike levels of mastery, but also a deflation, the eradication of this other person's power. And in this corrupted version of absolute power, power is a finite resource. The inflation of one comes at the expense of another. For a slave to gain power in this conception would require the master to lose power, which is why full slavery involves not just a claim on the slaves themselves, but on their children. So that in the country where this photograph was taken, often slavery is multi-generational. Because to allow slaves to create anything outside the scope of the master's power would be to diminish the master's power, so that the power all accrues to the slave owner, even the capability of procreating a child. For time out of mind, this had been the reality of life in Gudiotam. But when I met some of these ones whose names are on this list, they were no longer slaves. I took a couple pictures. These were two of the boys who'd worked in motorcycle shops, about the age of my son at that time. He's older now. And then there were these beautiful girls who are the age my daughter is now, about 12 years old. And they all filed into the offices of the local World Vision office, where World Vision had been working for 9 years. What had World Vision been doing during that time? Well, they had started a women's association. If you read very carefully, that list of released slaves was compiled by the Collangium Women's Federation, something that had never been done before, creating an environment where women could come together, talk about household economics, village economics, start saving money, start going to the bank and depositing money, something they'd never thought to do. World Vision had been working with local village councils to address issues of housing and jobs in this particular district. They'd started a citizenship training program, very interesting thing. Everyone in India is a citizen, but the members of the lower caste, so-called, don't think of themselves as citizens. And so World Vision had started to train them to think of themselves as citizens, to recognize their rights and responsibilities as citizens. And at every step, World Vision had educated the whole community about India's laws against bonded labor, the polite term for what is really, in effect, slavery, and the right of children to go to school. So by the time Jaikumar and I visited, slavery was dramatically reduced in this district. Not gone, but reduced. And these children, who just a couple years before had been working every day, not in school, came in their school uniforms and had lunch with us. And through a translator, I got to ask them a few questions. I got to ask the second girl from the right there, whose name, alas, I do not remember. We'll call her Ganti, since that's one of the names that was on the board. I asked her what she was hoping to do when she finished school, and she had a very quick answer. She said, I want to become a doctor. She said, there are no doctors in my village, so I want to train to be a doctor and come back and be the doctor for this village. I was trying to think of what else do you ask a 12-year-old when you've just met? It's awkward here, it's awkward there. I said, so what do you like to do after school? And I was thinking maybe play ball, or I don't know. And she said, my friends and I like to free slaves. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, there are still children in this district working under the system of bonded labor. So what we do is we go to the children who aren't coming to school. And my friends and I go, and every afternoon we find them and we tell them, you should be in school. You have every right to be in school. Your labor master can't keep you here. She said, and then we go to the slave owners and we tell them, you could get thrown in jail. And you should stop. This is wrong and it's illegal. And if you keep doing it, the police will come and throw you in jail. You can't get away with this anymore. In her spare time, it turns out that this 12-year-old was an abolitionist. First 12-year-old abolitionist I ever met. And you can see that these kids and their parents did not in any way lack for confidence, poise, self-assurance, hope. I sat with this thing they called the Children's Panchayat. The Panchayat is the local unit of government in villages like this. And they had a children's version. It was like the model UN. And we sat around on banana leaves in a clearing in the village. And these children practiced taking responsibility for their village. Talked about what they wanted it to be like when they grew up, what they wanted to change, what they wanted to keep the same. And on the train, on the way back home to Chennai, I said to Jaikumar, you have to help me with something. These people are very poor. They were very materially poor. There was not a lot in this village. I said, but Jaikumar, they don't act poor. They don't seem poor. And Jaikumar said two things to me that have pretty literally changed my life. The first thing he said is, Andy, when you see what you think is poverty, when you see someone you think that person looks poor, or this district looks poor, you need to realize that what you're seeing is not actually about lack of money. And it's not even about lack simply of political power or access. He said, when you see what seems like entrenched poverty, it's a sign of just one thing, that someone or some group of people has been playing God in the life of someone or some other group of people. The real root of what you call poverty, Andy, is not money. It's people playing God in the lives of others, the way that those slave owners play God in the lives of the children and families that they ensnare. And then he added something that really has challenged me ever since. He said, do you know my greatest fear about our work at World Vision? It's that we would replace one set of God players with ourselves and keep playing God in the lives of the poor. So that we would replace a malevolent set of God players, these local business owners, slave holders, with our benevolent form of God playing. Come in with all of our technical knowledge and expertise. Come in with our connections to Western donors. Come in with our connections to the Indian government. And simply replace one malevolent set of God players with benevolent God players. And in doing so, perpetuate the very poverty that we're here to relieve. Because only when we stop playing God will these people recognize their own capacity, their own agency, their own human dignity. To play God in the lives of the poor would leave them still poor. I want us to think tonight about the fundamental question that this story and this reality raises for us. This reality of the worst abuses of power happening right now, to some extent even in our own country, and to a broad extent in many places around the world, but also this remarkable story of a whole district where that reality had suddenly changed and was no longer the defining reality. And this story and this reality raise for us very acutely the question of power. And I think this is something we don't talk well enough about. Specifically, I want to talk about a more particular concept, power in general, but I want to talk tonight about authority, which I would simply define, and I'm kind of generally following sociology here, the way that sociologists think of the word authority, that authority is power, the ability to act efficaciously, effectively in the world. It's power plus trust. Authority is trusted power. That's all I intend by it when we talk about authority tonight. It's just power that some group of people places trust in. When someone trusts your power, you have authority. There's other kinds of power that don't come with trust. The bonded labor owners don't have trust, but they have power in that district. But what would a kind of power look like that has trust? Now, I want to distinguish two kinds of authority, and here's where it gets a little technical, and I act like a philosopher, which is a very bad thing to do for many reasons, especially when you're not one. I'm going to use a kind of philosophical shorthand, because I want to distinguish two further kinds of authority. Authority is power plus trust. But if you think about it, there's two ways to think about it. There's a descriptive form, you could say, and a prescriptive form, or a descriptive form and a normative form. And I'm going to call them authority 1 and authority 2. This is what philosophers do when they can't be bothered to think up better names for things. They just call it this 1 and this 2. So authority 1 is just descriptive. That is to say, we can recognize authority 1 when we just see that people trust some person with power. We just empirically observe it, all right? But there would also be a normative version, wouldn't there, where we would say, not only do we see that people do trust this person's power or this form of power, but they ought to trust it. It feels like it's not just trusted, but trustworthy. All right? Do you see the distinction I'm making? Because it's possible to trust in some form of power or authority that really is not trustworthy. I have a relative, I'm going to disguise how close or distant this relative may be, who places great trust in the historical and political insights of Glenn Beck. Well, so I see authority 1 there. When Glenn Beck speaks, I hear about what Glenn Beck has said about the state of our world from this relative. So this person trusts Glenn Beck, authority 1. But in my judgment, Glenn Beck should not be trusted the way that she trusts him. So authority 2 is missing, even though authority 1 is present. Last night I got on a plane in the face of an approaching hurricane, and I trusted the pilots to get me from Philadelphia to Detroit Airport. Authority 1. Empirically, I trusted them. I got here, authority 2. They were trustworthy, all right? So the pilots have both authority 1 and authority 2. We've learned to trust at a very high degree of confidence that when pilots say they can get you from one place to another, even though you look out the window and think, I don't think I'd want to fly a plane tonight, they know what they're doing. Another example, a great example, is meteorologists, because meteorologists used to just have authority 1. That is to say, they used to have no idea what they were doing. During World War II, I swear this is true because I've read it 3 times on separate places in the internet. The field commanders for the Allies had meteorologists, and they asked them to provide, on a rolling basis, 10-day forecasts for the weather in order to make their plans. And eventually, the meteorologists got so frustrated with this that they came to the generals and they said, our meteorology can only predict maybe 2 days. We have no idea what's going to happen in 10 days. Our forecasts are completely useless. And the reply was, you must keep the forecast coming so that we can continue to plan. All right, so that was authority 1. They were trusted, but no authority 2 for those extended range forecasts. But now, of course, meteorology has advanced to the point where we do have astonishingly reliable, maybe 10 days is still a bit much, but think of how much more we know about a hurricane like Sandy than we would have known even 10 years ago. So authority 2 has risen for meteorologists, even while all along we were looking at the weather forecast, authority 1. First premise of this talk, if you will, is that we can't live without authority. Authority 1. There's no way to go through life in the complex kind of world that at least that we live in without entrusting ourselves to other people's power. I think this is just empirically true. I don't think it actually is much of a claim. It's just true. All the time we entrust ourselves to people who claim a certain sphere of capacity, and we entrust ourselves to them. You certainly do it every time you get on an airplane. The second premise of this talk, and it's worded a little differently. I said we can't live without authority 1. But I would say we cannot flourish without authority 2. There's a difference between living and flourishing. There's a difference between merely existing or eking out life and living a rich, full, abundant life. And I would just suggest to you at this point, maybe I'll convince you, maybe I won't, that the only way human beings flourish in the world, that is, come to life in everything they're meant to be, is if they find sources of authority that are trustworthy. That is, not that they just put their trust in something willy-nilly, because we have to trust in something, but they find something to put their trust in, or a series of somethings or someones that truly can bear the weight of that trust. And it's when we find authorities in this very broad sense, people who have some capacity that we can trust in, that we truly should trust in, that we come alive as human beings. I'm going to try to persuade you of that in the next few minutes. Let's make one more distinction. Let's think about the kind of authority the pilots have, the airplane pilots have. And I would call this technical authority. In the domain of flying an airplane, which is at once extremely complex and in another way extremely simple, it comes down to a few laws of physics, of just a few equations. In this both very simple and highly complex domain, the pilots of my aircraft have almost perfect authority. They can replicate their power and be trusted with their power over a very wide range of conditions over and over, most of them through the course of a whole career, essentially flawlessly. It's quite extraordinary, right? And this is what I would call technical authority. Interestingly, this is mostly what universities now instill in us. That is, they attempt to instill in us, by the way, not just technical authority. One, people will trust you because you have a diploma from the University of Michigan. But authority two, people ought to trust you, right? Now, if you have a diploma from Berkeley University, which is spelled B-E-R-K-L-E-Y, and it exists only on the internet, right? You might be able to get people to give you authority one in some field, right? Say surgery. But you don't have authority two. You're not trustworthy. University of Michigan, on the other hand, if they let you out of here with a diploma in surgery or any other technical field, you not only have authority one, people will trust you in that field to exercise your power faithfully, but you will have authority two. You'll be trustworthy in that domain. But here's the odd thing about technical authority, which probably most of us are acquiring right now or have acquired in some field. Some more useful than others, classics, not so much, surgery, actually quite a lot. But we're all acquiring kind of technical authority. But the interesting thing is, the more precise and reliable technical authority is, for example, the authority to fly an airplane, the less broadly useful it is. The more precisely useful it is, the less broadly useful it is. So think about this. The pilots of my plane could tell me whether or not we could safely fly to Detroit with a very high level of authority. However, they are of almost no use in saying whether I should be going to Detroit or Ann Arbor, right? If I had asked my pilot, now I know you can get me to Detroit and then to Ann Arbor, but should I go? I think the only proper response would be, that is above my pay grade, right? I can't answer that question. They don't have the slightest power to tell me whether I should go to Ann Arbor or not. Very odd to be entrusting myself to these people who know so much about how to do it, but have no idea whether I should do it. And in a nutshell, this is our very particular modern problem, which is that in our society we have greater and greater technical authority. There are more and more domains where we know a great deal about how to exercise power in a trustworthy way, in a way that delivers the results we hope. And less what I want to call ultimate authority. That is, we entrust more and more of our lives to specialists who have real trustworthy power in a technical field, but fewer and fewer of us know where to turn for help with the ultimate questions of life that are ultimately far more important, because much more important than the question of, can I go to Ann Arbor, is the question, should I go to Ann Arbor? Where do I go? What authority do I go to answer not just the technical question, but the ultimate question, should I go to Ann Arbor? So here's the corollary of my first two premises. First, I said we can't live without authority one. We can't live without putting our trust in someone else's power. And I would say that's not just true in the technical sense. I can't fly my own plane. I've got to trust someone else to fly my plane. But in the ultimate sense, I don't think you can live without trusting someone or something else to exercise power in your life by guiding you not just in the how questions, but in the should questions. I think you've got to entrust yourself at some point to some authority to figure out Who am I supposed to be? And even if you say, well, I trust myself, you are actually standing in a very long line of authorities in Western culture. Rousseau, Nietzsche, who have taught you to think that you are a sufficient authority, who have given you that sense of power, who have enabled you to exercise at least authority one in your own life, to trust yourself. You're relying on a much longer story of people explaining that that's a viable path to a good life. But if we can't live without authority one, not just technically, but ultimately, I think it's also true that we can't flourish, that is, we can't become everything we're meant to be without authority two. That is, not just finding something, anything to trust, but actually finding someone or something that's actually trustworthy. So, here's the question I want to wrestle with for the next 10 or 15 minutes. Can power ever be trustworthy? Isn't that the question that we would need to ask? Can you ever trust anyone that much in an ultimate sense? We know it can be trustworthy in these technical, limited ways. But can power ever be that trustworthy? And if so, what makes power trustworthy? Not just authority one, but authority two. And the reason these questions matter, of course, is that power in this world is not trustworthy, as 27 million slaves can attest. 27 million people right now are under the thumb of someone whose power cannot be trusted, should not be trusted, and whose power should be brought to an end with whatever legitimate means we can muster. Lord Acton saw this coming. It's probably worth reminding ourselves of the most famous thing that's probably been said about power in the last 150 years. And I want to give you the context for it. You'll recognize the little soundbite, but let's read the whole context. A letter to his friend in 1887, Lord Acton wrote this. It's a very telling, I think, point he's making. I cannot accept your canon, that canon meaning rule at this time, that we are to judge Pope and King unlike other men, with a favorable presumption that they did no wrong. In other words, giving them kind of authority one, just trusting in them automatically. If there is any presumption, it is the other way, against the holders of power, increasing as the power increases. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Now, here he's using the word in a different way. I think he's using word authority to mean a title or a position, right? And so you could have influence without having a title. But still more is this the case when you superadd the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority. Once you give people the title, then you're really in trouble. And then this wonderful line, this should be as famous as the more famous one. There is no worse heresy than that the office sanctifies the holder of it. So power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's something that rings true in this for us, isn't there? Because we see the effects of untrustworthy power. The fact that often power, even power granted authority, even power that people trust in, ends up diminishing, even destroying everything we hope for as human beings. That's the first reason we have to ask this question. The second is more uncomfortable. It's that we have power. This is not a problem for other people. The problem with Lord Acton's thing is it gets us thinking about great men with titles and positions that we fortunately don't have. So we look at them and we think, ah, yes, corrupt. But we are at a university because we are seeking power of some kind. And we have it. And if you doubt whether you have it, you need to meet a slave and ask them how they see you. And you'll discover how much agency you have, how much room for maneuver, how much ability you have to decide what your life means, decide ultimate questions in a way that millions of people do not have the power. And we've all got it in this room. Tremendous amount of agency. There's a wonderful thing happening in this room. I hope it doesn't happen too much, but people are leaving in the midst of my talk. To me, this is a bit disconcerting, but they may have somewhere to be. They may have found the first part so profound they can't bear to hear anymore. I mean, there are any number of explanations. that's not to be taken for granted, right? What is that? It's an expression of power, right? There are places in the world where when someone's on stage, if you leave, you get shot. That doesn't happen at the University of Michigan, as far as I know. Although, if too many more of you leave, I may ask for it to be instated. But no, this is a gift. We take it so for granted, right, in our culture, that, well, of course, if someone has to get up for whatever reason and go, they would go. Don't take that for granted. We have power. Vaya con Dios, someone's taking the power right now. This is not a bad thing. It represents something we've been given. But the question, of course, is, how will we go from authority 1 to authority 2 ourselves? Us. I've got this. I've been entrusted with it. How in the world do I know that I'm going to use it any better than anyone else? How will I be kept from this kind of corruption? What will keep me from playing God, even a benevolent, good works doing God in the life of other people? My deepest fear, Jacomar said, is that we will end up playing God in the lives of the poor, that we with power will play God in the lives of those who have no or little power. How will we become worthy of what we've been given? Very broadly speaking, there are 3 ways to approach this. One is to say, well, power is just bad, and it's bad that we have it, and we'll just have to deal with it. And in this, we would have good company. We'd have company like Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most influential people in our intellectual history. Nietzsche wrote this in 1886, interestingly, very close to Lord Acton's own little letter. And it's a magnificently compressed and compelling statement of one way of thinking about power. Here's what he wrote. My idea, Nietzsche said, is that every specific body strives to become master over all space and to extend its force, that is to say, its will to power, and to thrust back all that resists its extension. But it continually encounters similar efforts on the part of other bodies and ends by coming to an arrangement or union with those of them that are sufficiently related to it. Thus, they then conspire together for power, and the process goes on. What's Nietzsche saying here? What he's saying is every body, and by this he means, I think, most of all, every human body, is on a quest to expand its influence, its territory. So Nietzsche would look at this room, and he would say, aha, I know exactly what's happening. Andy Crouch is a specific body, and he has this vision of becoming master over all space. And so he's starting with a lecture hall, right? He's attached an amplifying device to his little vest, right? So that his voice is projected beyond his natural abilities. He's fulfilling his desire to expand his influence beyond even where his body can go. The only problem is the room's full of all these other bodies, and they all would like to do the same thing. And some of them will come to these microphones in a little bit and attempt to extend their power, right? And Nietzsche would say, so what's going on? Now, why are you all sitting there so docilely as I try to take over? Well, because we're sufficiently related. These particular bodies are sufficiently related, maybe because we're all interested in truth, a fine word, but we'll pretend for the moment, right? We'll all come together around truth, or perhaps we all have certain class interests or certain economic interests, and for the moment, we're going to conspire together, and you'll let me have my time on the stage, then maybe I'll let you have your time. But the truth is, what we're all in this for is to expand our own mastery. And eventually, my desire, Nietzsche would say, is not to conspire with you. It's to overcome you. It's to use you on my way to fully dominating the space in which I live. This is a very compelling picture of what's happening in human relationships. And if you start looking for it, you'll see it. It really does describe something real. But if it's true, then we could have authority 1, That is to say, we could, in temporary provisional ways, entrust ourselves, perhaps to a Napoleon or a Stalin or some latter-day dictator. We could temporarily subsume our interests under the interests of the great, the Ubermensch, the supermen who do this at a world historical level. But if this is true, there is no such thing as ultimate authority too. No one can ever be truly trusted. You can't trust me with the power you're giving me right now. I'm going to misuse it as soon as you give me room. And I can't trust you. And that means, in a Nietzschean world, there is life. But for most of us, there's no such thing as flourishing, because flourishing requires trustworthy power. And Nietzsche says, that's an illusion. There's no such thing as trustworthy power. Now, there's another way of looking at it. I want to lay out the options. You could say, that's a little cynical. I don't think power is all bad. I just think it's neutral. It can be used for good or bad. So it's not always bad. It's not always about domination. It's sort of how you use it. It's like a lot of resources in our world. It's not till you use it for something that it becomes a problem. Guns don't kill people. People kill people, right? And in a way, I don't think this is totally wrong, but here's the only way I think it's really right to say power is neutral. I think power is neutral like the neutral wire in a 3-wire household electrical system is neutral. Now, most of us in this room, including me, are not electrical engineers, but from extensive research on Wikipedia, I've discovered that you've got those 2 prongs, right? Then you have the ground wire, which is in use a lot now, but is kind of optional. But then you have what's often called the hot lead, and then you've got what's called the neutral lead. And the question is, would you be willing to grab on, in bare feet, standing on a wet concrete floor, to a neutral lead? And the answer is, you could do that. And you would probably be okay. Because the neutral lead is supposed to be closer to ground, that's why it's called neutral, compared to hot, and it should be okay. But no one in this room would ever do that. Because you don't know for sure that it's okay. Because you don't know for sure that every electrician who's ever worked on that system before you wired everything right. And if anyone miswired anything, you grab that neutral lead and you get 120 or 240 volts flowing from you to the wet concrete. I think power is neutral that way. And the reason I think so is I think we have tons of reasons to believe that our human wiring has gone totally awry. We are miswired. I just don't see how you can deny that. When you look at people who will enslave other people, it's neutral like the neutral wire. You don't grab it. It's too powerful for that. I have a third view. And I have it because I am a Christian. Part of what it is to be a Christian, and Augustine really helped us with this, is that you fundamentally believe that there is something good about the world. It's a very counterintuitive thing to believe. But that's what Christians have come to believe. There's something fundamentally good about the world, and indeed, the things that are wrong in the world don't have independent existence. They're actually, this is Augustine's idea, just the deprivation of good. Evil doesn't have any real existence in the Christian view. It's just the absence of something good. So if you've got anything at all, it has some residue or some reality of goodness. And I believe, not with Nietzsche, that power is just always bad, always domination, nor do I believe with the optimist that power is neutral, even neutral like the neutral wire. I've come to believe it's good, and it's so good, it's dangerous. It's so good that it's dangerous. Very much like the power flowing through my home, I hope, as of 6:30 p.m., there was still power in our house. Why do I want there to be power in my house? Because it's good. But what happens if it's miswired, or if I grab onto that power for purposes it's not meant for? Incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly good and incredibly dangerous. And it seems to me that's the truth about power. I don't want the power to go out. In fact, in places like Udiatam, I want the power to come on. I want a child like Auntie to realize she has the power to be an abolitionist. I celebrate when she has power. I don't say, oh, power, that's bad. Or, Auntie, you know, you are actually just a Nietzschean actor attempting to extend your power and dominate all space. And can you imagine saying to Gandhi, who's worked in conditions of slavery, saying, you know, Gandhi, I sort of think power is neutral. You know, can be good, can be bad. She's experienced it as its absolute searing worst. How can I say that? Instead, what I want to say to her is, power is good. It's good that you are becoming an agent of change in your community. And you, as with every other human being, need to know it's so good, it's dangerous. All right, I have 5 more minutes, and I want to try to make the case for this with a picture of the most beautiful physicist in the world, who is my wife. Think about the power of a teacher. Catherine's scrawling equations that I can't interpret, but when she takes you through a semester of quantum mechanics, at the end of it, if you've got the talent, you can understand it. What happens there? Well, admittedly, technical authority, but it's a model of something. What happens in that exchange? It's interesting. I think about this with my own studies. I don't study physics, but I'm studying cello. I have a cello teacher. When Catherine's students walk into her physics classroom, or I walk into my cello teacher's studio, they have a certain amount of power to understand physics, or I have a certain amount of power to play the cello. When they walk out at the end of that hour, when I walk out from my lesson, the amount of power to understand physics has increased slightly, right? And when I walk out of my cello teacher's studio, I have slightly more power to play the cello than when I went in. The interesting thing is that the teacher's power has not diminished in any way. It's not a zero-sum thing, right? It's what we call a positive-sum game, right? There's actually more, after an hour of cello lessons, or an hour in Catherine's physics class, there's more power in the world than there was before to do certain things. It's interesting, it doesn't work that way with money. When I walk into my cello teacher's studio, at the beginning I have $50. At the end he has $50, and all my dollars are gone, he has the 50, right? Not so with the power. He doesn't, in fact, when you teach, you actually acquire a little more power yourself. The sum total of power in the world to do these beautiful things, these amazing things like math, physics, music, is increasing when people teach. The American artist Henry Osawa Tanner painted this remarkable painting called the Banjo Lesson, in which an older man has a young boy sitting on his lap. And he's learning the banjo. And it's a painting, among many other things, about power. A painting about trustworthy power. Do you see in this authority one, right? The boy trusts this older man. I thought for many years this must be a grandfather, but friends of mine who know this world have pointed out to me that families were so disrupted by slavery that you wouldn't really assume that these were related necessarily, but at least not lineally. Maybe this is an uncle, maybe it's a cousin, an older cousin. At any rate, this older man is trusted by the boy, and he's trustworthy. And this is not just a painting about technical skill, learning to play the banjo. There's ultimate things going on here. This is a painting about family, about love, about relationship. Tanner, who is a Christian artist, has placed at the back a jug of something and a loaf, symbols for Christians of this transformative meal that we share. He's saying there's something sacred about the passing on of culture from generation to generation. This is a picture of good power, not neutral power, not dominating power, but power that actually creates more power. One more picture. This is Sir Gillian Prance. He's one of the world's leading experts in rainforest ecology. And Sir Gillian has a very interesting perspective on the rainforests. We think of the rainforests as these places of of teeming life, right? Just so many species, and so many species found nowhere else in the world. Sir Gillian has demonstrated in the course of his long career that's made him a fellow of the Royal Society and so forth, that one of the primary drivers of biodiversity in the rainforest is human interaction with the rainforest. That actually the reason the rainforest is so biodiverse is because human beings have been working in it in ways that preserve the diversity. Not so much like we moderns might do, just turn it into Disneyland, but in ways that keep it flourishing. They're trustworthy. Their power is exercised in such a way in the rainforest that actually more things grow there than would otherwise. He points out that the island of Britain was an oak monoculture before human settlement. But now that human beings have settled it, exercised power in very patient ways with the land, it's now one of the best places in the world to watch birds. You don't get lots of different birds in an oak monoculture. Now it's this incredibly diverse environment because human beings actually at times and in certain places have used their power in the world that, in a way that actually expands the possibilities of the world. And we all know that Lord Acton wasn't actually right. Because Lord Acton says this, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But we all, almost every person in this room, almost everyone, has a defeater for that claim. Because there was a point in our lives when someone had absolute power over us. Absolute power. It's when we were a baby. Having had two, I can tell you, when you have a baby, you are astonished at the level of power you have in their lives. It's the most frightening thing that can ever happen to a human being. I highly recommend it. You realize I have complete control. And of course, there are some who are corrupted by that, and terrible things are occasionally done. But the overwhelming likelihood is none of us got to this room without the people who had absolute power over us. They didn't use their power perfectly, not at all. But they were not absolutely corrupted, even though they had absolute power over us. And for most of us, their power, their authority too, their trustworthy power led to our flourishing, led to us being in rooms like this, led to us having the kind of friendships and opportunities we have. So here's what I want to say to Nietzsche, and now I really am finishing. Here's what Nietzsche said. I'm going to do a very Nietzschean thing to Nietzsche. I'm going to erase his words and replace them with my own. So my words are going to gradually dominate Nietzsche's words. Thrusting back Nietzsche. And here's what I'm going to say. Nietzsche, you say my idea is that every specific body strives to become master over all space. All right, Nietzsche, my idea is that all true being strives to create room for more being and to expend its power in the creation of flourishing environments for variety and life and to thrust back the chaos that limits true being. In doing so, it creates other bodies. Rather than encountering these problem other bodies, it actually wants to create more bodies. And ends by coming to, how does it end? No, it invites them into mutual creation and tending of the world, building relationships where there had been none. Thus they then cooperate together in creating more power for more creation, and the process goes on. What do you believe is ultimately true about the world? Is it a Nietzschean world, or is it this world? I'd suggest both require faith. I've come to believe this is truer about power. And I'm skipping several things I would have said if I had time. Let me end this way. I've actually come to believe that Jaikumar was not quite right. I don't actually think the question is whether we will play God or not. I think the question is actually which God we will play. Whatever you think is ultimately true about the world will ultimately shape the way you use the power in the world, your technical power and your ultimate power, authority. And you'll either play a God who seeks to thrust back everything, to be God of the world as much as it was within your grasp, or you'll play a different kind of God. A God who actually invites more being, creates more power, creates what in the Christian frame we call image bearers who live out that power in the world. So the question isn't whether you're going to trust some authority, but whether the authority we trust will be adequate to our trust and our need to trust. Whether the power that we serve and the power we imitate will be adequate to the world's deepest needs. My thinking about this really started on that train from Guriatam. Having looked into the eyes of children who had known literal slavery and real freedom, sitting next to this man Jaikumar as he dozed off after a long and intense day of listening to and loving these girls, their parents, their communities, his staff, their neighbors. He's sitting there dozing next to me, and I remember thinking, I'm inches from a saint. These are the moments that have shaped my life, the moments when I see that the world is infinitely worse and infinitely better than it appears. And that is what I've come to believe about power. Thank you all so much for listening, and now I look forward to conversation. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question was, you talked about technical power and ultimate power, and sort of the difference between the questions between how can I and should I. Yes. And I'm wondering, what is it about the question should I that you call it ultimate, so it sounds almost like it has a higher status or superior status.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious more about the qualities of that question and why it's the ultimate.
Yes.
Why should is above how.
Yeah. Why wouldn't questions of how be in some ways the deepest questions we could ask?
Right.
No, that's a wonderful question. And I do think there are some very profound how questions. For example, how do we free 27 million slaves? That is not a merely technical question. Like, oh, well, we just need to apply a little expertise here and there and we'll be done. So that actually gets very deep, right? And it has qualities of ultimacy to it. I think what I had in mind, though, is that there's another set of questions that are intrinsically more complex, because the question, should I go to Ann Arbor? I mean, where do you begin? You know, if I asked you that question, you'd have to get to know me, right? There would have to be a kind of relational process, for one thing. There would be all these other things that would come into it. There would be judgments that are very hard to reduce to expertise. And of course, the other thing you can do is the 3-year-old thing. So the 3-year-old just keeps asking why, right? Right? So on the one hand, the 3-year-old can keep asking how, right? So, Daddy, how does the light come on? Well, Timothy, we turn the switch and the light comes on. Well, but why does that? You know, how does that work? And how? And then at some point in that sequence, I say, go talk to Mommy. She's a physicist, right? And eventually, it's all physics, right? So you can take that trail and you get to physics, really. Or math, actually, right? Math, and our universe is so amazingly constructed that math and physics correlate. Who would have thought? Makes you think someone had something to do with it. But on the other hand, if you say, should I go to Ann Arbor? Well, let's ask about purpose. Let's ask another question about purpose. Let's ask another question about purpose. You do not arrive at a domain of highly specified knowledge at the end of that chain of questions. There's no physicist waiting at the end of that chain to say, well, you finally got to the real bottom of things, here's how it works. You instead arrive at mystery, right? And that's the sense in which those questions are ultimate, in a way that the technical questions are not, as profound and complex as they are. Yeah. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. Thank you.
You connected to purpose, it sounds like. Ultimate questions are dealing with purpose, with...
Yes, and what I'm trying to make the case for is that we need to find trustworthy ways of navigating not just the how questions, but the should and purpose questions. That we're just as in need of help with those as we are with the how questions. But our society doesn't know how to give us help on these. Yeah. It knows how to help on the physics stuff.
Because I even had a friend who suggested to me, he would say, I think that the word should be eliminated from people's vocabulary. He's like, I hate that word. So
Yeah,
that's why I was.
I'm not attached to the word exactly,
Right.
but the sense of direction we need, whether it's should or
Right.
where can I go? Why, I don't know, pick your alternative, but we've got to have some way of deciding, do I go to Ann Arbor or not?
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk too. I had a question on, you gave an example of the child and how the parent, through the child, the fact that they grew up is an example of worthiness in the power that he had, right? And they did well with it, right?
Yes.
But that was only in hindsight, right? The baby at the moment can't tell that. So I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are then in terms of, let's say, quote unquote, blind steps of faith to accept one's authority, because it seems like what you're saying is only in terms of, oh, now I recognize that it deserves authority.
Yes, we are best at recognizing our parents' authority to retrospectively. At the time, we weren't so fond of it, maybe, right? And now that they're paying for college, it's great, but back then, yeah, that is a very interesting question. How do you prospectively decide this person or this thing is worthy of my trust? That's a fantastic question. I think the honest answer to that question is I don't know, because it does require faith. The one thing I need to be aware of is, of course, I'm going to have to, I believe I'm going to have to trust somebody. And I've come too far in life to be comfortable trusting myself. I think that's easier when you're younger. It gets harder to maintain. So one thing I have to realize is I'm going to have to put my trust somewhere for these ultimate questions. So then I think I have to ask, I have to ask given that I'm not going to have enough evidence to know for sure that I can trust you, I have to try to assess with the limited evidence I can what's worth putting my weight on. I don't know anything else to do. This might be a useful thing to clarify, since this is, among other things, a conversation about faith, religious faith. I want to dispel, for those of you who perhaps don't identify as Christians, the idea that we Christians think we've somehow arrived at some incredibly solid ground that we just kind of march forward completely sure of what we're doing. That is nothing like what it was like for the first people who met Jesus of Nazareth. It's not what it's like to be a Christian now. We, on the basis of best evidence, best account of reality, I look at Nietzsche's view, I look at my Nietzschean undermining of Nietzsche's view, and I say, which of these do I believe is more adequate to the way I experience the world, and what would it look like to put my trust in that? And it's provisional, inevitably, to some extent. So it takes faith. It really does. It really does. But not faith without evidence, not faith without assessment, but it just takes a risking of oneself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I was going to ask his question, but I will ask a similar one.
Yeah, sure.
What has led you to believe that you are not a trustworthy authority?
What are the signs of authority not being trustworthy?
No, what has led you personally to believe that you are not a trustworthy authority?
Oh, thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm. How did I come to think that I couldn't trust myself?
Yeah.
Wow, how long do we have? How many ex-girlfriends should I talk through their experience of me? So we do often learn this in relationship. I mean, that's a bit of a flippant comment, but unfortunately it's kind of true that, of course, in our most intimate relationships are where we really find out who we are. Those relationships can take many forms, but I can give you names and addresses of people who'd be glad to help you understand how untrustworthy I was in the very relationships where I was aiming to be the most trustworthy. And I'm now married, by the grace of God, for 18 years to someone who has kept with me in spite of the fact, this is one of the very odd things we Christians do. We make these vows that we really cannot keep fully. We can keep them more or less. We can keep them in certain technical ways, but in ultimate ways, we make them and we do break them. And so that beautiful, amazing woman, Catherine, has been the mirror to me to discover how broken I am. How, even when I'm trying to do the right thing, I don't do the right thing. And I'm often not trying to do the right thing. I'm much more I'm amazingly Nietzschean. And wow, you discover that when you are in a relationship where you're rubbing up against another one of those specific bodies that itself has its own issues. So that's how I found out, is through other people and through my failures to do the very best that I wanted to do. This summer I read Simon Schama's amazing book, Citizens, about the precursors and the unfolding of the French Revolution. And Robespierre is such an amazing figure. He was so committed to virtue. Virtue was everything for Robespierre. He didn't believe in any authority other than his own virtue. And he presided over one of the most just mutilating and traumatic experiences ever. It's like reading about any genocide that we've had in our own lifetimes. And that was a man who trusted in himself. And it ultimately consumed him. That's what you'll find out if you pursue that, I think, and if you're honest. So that's how it was for me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi. I was wondering if you could unpack. It seemed like you had an assumption. When I was thinking about the statement you made that power's good. It's so good, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to think. I was trying to piece together in my mind, because that's not necessarily intuitive to me.
Yeah.
You know, sort of like, okay, well, why? Why is that? And it sounded like towards the end you were saying, maybe with like the cello analogy, how power is good because it adds capacity to create something.
Yes.
It adds capacity for being.
Yeah.
And so I was measuring that up against some life experience and other things where I think at times I would say, or people I know would say, existence doesn't feel good. Just because there's more of something,
right.
it doesn't mean it's good.
Yes.
Or I experience extra existence is actually not as good as less existence or less things in being. And so
Yes.
I was just wondering if you could tie together that conviction of yours that more things being and more possibilities is better than fewer possibilities.
Right. That's very good. Thank you for raising that. I was talking with someone about question and answer sessions, getting ready for this, and they said, you know, the norm in America is you only have 3 seconds. And you know, often you need 3 minutes before you even have anything useful to say. Why is it that I believe? So you talk for 3 minutes and then you figure it out, but that's not really that helpful. Why is it that I believe that more being is better? I have to admit, I'm not sure I can prove it to you. And your own story may make it especially hard to make the case. And certainly we'd know people in the world who would say, well, why is more of this better? People right now. I suppose, to be honest, it is a matter of faith for me, because I look at the teeming diversity of the world and match that with the claim that the maker of the world called this teeming diversity good. And I say there's something good about abundance. Something is better than nothing, and more variety and more flourishing is better than less. And I do want to say, I'm not just talking about more existence, because I think what power is for is not existence, but flourishing. Power is for flourishing. The test of power is flourishing. So by the way, I mean, this is how I would evaluate my use of my power tonight, or how I would have you evaluate it. So I've used a lot of power in this last hour and a half. A lot of electrical power, a lot of time, attention, airtime, right? And to me, the test of power is flourishing. And by that I mean, do you leave tonight feeling more able to be fully yourself, who you were made to be, whatever that means to you? And if you instead leave feeling diminished, constrained, constricted, and especially if everybody kind of leaves that way, that does happen sometimes, right? When you get speakers with really big egos, the only person who flourishes in the room is the person on stage. If I use this power well, then it's not just that you keep existing, but you actually feel, when he said that, or when he showed that picture, or when I thought that thought in response to what he said, I came alive a little bit. That's a little bit of flourishing. And that's what I experienced in my cello lessons. Look, you know, it doesn't matter if there's more cellists in the world. And certainly not cellists at my level. I mean, I no longer murder Bach, but I maim Bach regularly, right? But I tell you, I come out of those lessons, it's the most flourishing thing I do all week. It just brings me alive to things and experiences I couldn't access before. And I think that's what power is meant to do. I hope that helps, at least a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi. You said that power is not purely evil because we have the capacity to use it for either good or bad. But if we look at the history of human action, specifically, I guess, in the realm of politics in the 20th century, it does seem that that good, or the capacity to do good, is only a potential. And this, to me, seems to be the real problem, because why does it matter if we have the capacity to do good if we don't use it?
Yes.
And if this is the case, isn't Friedrich Nietzsche more or less right?
Yeah.
Your comments.
Yes. So it's very hard to know how to weigh in the balance all the evidence of history, isn't it? Because we cannot be anything but conscious of the horror of the use of power in our time and in our moment in history. I mean, more people killed in the 20th century than all previous centuries, and in the name of political power, mostly. So I don't know how to weigh that against what I would consider to be the two most extraordinary things in my lifetime, politically. I don't know which to list first, but the end of the domination of communism in Eastern Europe, peacefully, by and large, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which for those of us who were alive at that time will never forget, and the transition in many, though not all of those societies, to something much more humane than what preceded them, accomplished through political means. And to me, the more dramatic example, the end of apartheid in South Africa, which no one saw coming in the way that it happened. And the only way it happened was through the exercise of power. And very interesting. Power from below, you could say, the power of Nelson Mandela, and power from above, the power of F.W. de Klerk, who only de Klerk could have negotiated with Mandela the peaceful end of apartheid. Now, those are just two examples, and how do we weigh them up? But they happened, and no one thought they could happen before they happened. The sort of common sense was they couldn't happen. Does that help? I'd love to hear your further thoughts about that.
Yes, it helps, but I would argue that just in the grand scheme of things, the positive things that human beings have accomplished politically are, in a sense, drowned out by all the negative action that human beings have done. So that's kind of what I meant, that not literally that good is only existent in potential, but just...
Right. So, I don't know. I don't know whether one example is enough to sort of defeat the premise that it can never happen, or if we need a balance. And I will agree with you that it's hardest to see this in the political realm, I think. We're going to talk tomorrow night about business. I feel much more readily able to see how, in many cases, business leads to flourishing. And if we had politicians on the stage, I don't know if I'd be showing up to moderate. I just wouldn't be as excited, at least. I'd have more cynicism, I think. But I feel obligated. Again, some of this goes back to faith. Like, who are you gonna trust? What are you gonna believe? But I feel obligated to hope. To be honest, I feel I'm not allowed to become cynical, which is to say to give up on hope. I can be realistic and I can be measured in what I expect of politics, but I can't give up hope, and I don't give up hope. I mean, not so much in my lifetime, but the extraordinary progress, not complete, but real extraordinary progress that the U.S. made in civil rights in the 20th century, in the midst of lots of terrible things, was a completely political thing that is of incalculable value for the flourishing of our society. And it happened through politics. It's the best I can do.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your conversation.
Thank you.
I kind of have a question tying the beginning of your talk to the end of your talk. I loved your question about can power be trustworthy?
Yes.
And you started off by stating that power can be viewed as finite in a relationship of inflation versus deflation of individuals. And I was a little worried that, okay, we have a finite amount of power. But then you got to a point about power can be net positive in the example of teaching.
Yes.
But I do agree that there's some truth in your beginning statement that there is a trade. There are types of power that are trade-offs.
Yes.
And so I was actually curious about, in a room full of people who have power here and who will have more in the future, that part of that power is a choice to give power to others. And so I was wondering if you could comment on the potential value or trustworthiness of power in a self-deflated sense to inflate others.
Yes. Yeah, there are sometimes, there are sometimes when power, when well used, simply leads to more. But there are sometimes when there are sacrifices actually to be made. And I think this is part, someone asked, how do you know who to trust or what's trustworthy? One way to ask the question would be, is this powerful person or entity I'm thinking about trusting willing to sacrifice? Because when power curdles into privilege and ultimately into status, by the way, status is the ultimate zero sum, because it's by definition rank ordered, right? And a lot of us knew what our rank was in school or, in certain classes or whatever. And only one person gets to be in each spot, right? And once power is about securing privilege and status for myself, it quickly curdles into this zero sum or negative sum thing, actually, amazingly enough, where we all lose. And what interrupts that process? It's sacrifice. It's when I'm willing to give power away and step away from something. So very concretely, just because maybe it helps be concrete, for me as a journalist, this happened in an extraordinary way. And fortunately, I knew the right thing to do, and I did it, which I don't always do, ask my wife and ex-girlfriends. But a year ago, I got to write a big piece for the Wall Street Journal. It was a big journalistic break. And 4 weeks later, they asked me to write another piece, which is very rare that you get to write two of these review pieces. There are 2 pages in the Saturday Wall Street Journal. The first piece was about Steve Jobs. I wrote that. They called me back 4 weeks later and said, we want you to write about Tim Tebow. Now, problem number 1 is I know nothing about Tim Tebow. But for a Nietzschean journalist, that would not be a problem. You already know I'm very adept with Wikipedia, right? So all of my career ambition would have been to say, this is a huge break to get to write twice for the Wall Street Journal in the review section and write this big piece about this big famous guy, and all of journalism is basically about drafting on the celebrity of others, right? That's sort of our Nietzschean conspiracy. So why not do this, right? Well, because I know nothing about football, but aside from that, why not do it? And I had the presence of mind to realize I should give this to another writer. I should recommend another writer to do this, who's a guy named Patton Dodd. He's younger than me, he's less established, but he had just written an ebook on Tim Tebow. I was like, Patton is the person to write this article. So I called the editor back, and I said, I shouldn't write that for you, but I know who should, and here's his name. And Patton did write it, and it became the most forwarded article in the Wall Street Journal the whole year. And it was a huge boost for him. And the truth is, I wouldn't have done it well anyway, but the Nietzschean thing to do would have been to hold it all for myself. And for once, I did what I ought to have done. I gave up power in a way that released someone else to flourish. So that's a big test. Do we give up power when other people can flourish in order that other people can flourish? Yes?
I'd just like to say that you just tied should and sacrifice together.
Huh.
Should. Somebody said, I want to get rid of should.
Yeah.
Obligation.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity.
Huh.
The conscience that we have. The should, we want to get rid of it. And the sacrifice that should gave to us.
I think you're right to push back on the idea that we could actually get rid of it. The reason we want to get rid of should is we're fearful that we won't flourish under the conditions of obligation. That if I submit myself to this authority 2 or authority 1, it won't prove to be a flourishing experience. The truth is that even sacrifice, and of course this is why I'm a Christian. The creator who did my little rewrite there, who wanted more and more being, didn't stop at just creating more being, but actually entered into the world sacrificially to bear its pain. I can trust the shoulds of a creator like that, a power like that, that's that sacrificial.
How do you answer the should of a person who doesn't accept that sacrifice? And the person who is not willing to acknowledge the should or God,
yeah,
how can you address should to that person who
yeah, if someone says, well, but I don't accept the obligations that God allegedly requires of me. All I could do, I suppose, is ask, well, what do you feel you are serving? What is your ultimate? And how's it going? How's that? Because I really believe we're all serving some ultimate reality. And my belief is that the other ultimate realities on offer are not as generous and leading to flourishing as the Creator, self-sacrificing God. So the question is, how is that thing you're serving? What is it producing in your life? Is it producing flourishing? And if it feels like it is, then it'll be hard for me to persuade you, of course. But perhaps over time it will not seem to continue to deliver in the ways that it currently does. And then I've got a great alternative to suggest. Yes?
Thanks for your talk. I just wanted to ask your opinion on this part of a verse from 2 Corinthians 12:9. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. And how that related to what you talked about.
Yeah, well, it ties in well. Thank you for bringing it up, because it ties in well with some of what we've been talking about. That there's this, I didn't get into this, but the mysterious thing, at least for Christians. Now, Nietzsche hated this, by the way. This is the thing he hated about Christianity, was that the Christian testimony to the world is that the ultimate generative, creative, indeed recreative power that's at work in the world actually is pleased to work even when it seems like human power is not working at all, even when we feel completely weak. Now, I see that as the best news you could have, because I see that as news for that 12-year-old girl. That when you're a slave, you are not out of options. There's actually a power in the world that is specifically for you in your powerlessness. So I see it as the best news you could have, that this is not about us just sort of ginning up our own power until we can do something good with it. It's about something much deeper, that when things seem most broken and wrong, there's actually this power at work to turn them right. And this, of course, is what we call resurrection, right? Nietzsche did not like it. I like it. I think it's good news. I think it's much better news than anything Nietzsche came up with. So I'd go for that.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.